Right, hello there. We're just going to go live. So, Creatormas 2020. So, as we were talking in the last video, talking about normal maps and using those with IMVU Studio. So, what we're going to do is create a couple of little projects, hopefully over the coming couple of days, where we create an item that makes use of normal maps. Right, so just double check all the streams are working because it was playing around the other day. Everything seems to be oakley dokley. Right, so yes, as we were looking at the other day, taking a look at normal maps. So let's just open the normal map test product. And what we'll do is just make a simple product that uses a normal map, and we'll use Blender 3D. That's Blender 2.83 LTS. That's long-term support version, although it should work in Blender 2.9. What are we up to now? 2.91? 2.91. But we'll create a little box and set that up as a furniture item, and then we'll see how the normal maps work. So let me close this and let's create new general. Just reset Blender, get it back to its defaults, and then what we want to do is load in the furniture starter file so that we have a file, well, a scaling reference, a scale reference. So, and those are available at linky link. Where are they? So they're available at that link if you are using Blender 2.9. No, 2.8. Yes, anything above 2.8, use those. 2.79, and you'll need a different set. You'll need these instead, but what we're about to do will work with those just as well. Too many windows. Right, so let's drop in the furniture file, which is furniture example nodes. Open. Right, so all we're going to do is just create a box. So we're going to use these default cubes which represent our basic mesh stroke furniture item. So you could, if you wanted to, export these objects and you would have a functional furniture item, although it'd just be a cube. But what this does, or what this file includes, oh no, it hasn't frozen. What this file includes are the basic elements that are necessary to make a furniture item. So we have our seating. So we have sitting avatar, we have standing avatar, and then we have our, which one's that? That's ceiling. Let's just move that out of the way. we have wall. That's our wall units. So we have ceiling, wall, and then we have floor mounted furniture. And each one of these has a root node, which is highlighted, and then the mesh that's attached to it. Just noticed that we need to reset the scale, so 100. And just double check our sidebar settings, view, scale, that's all right. So reset that. Zero. So we can select, if we want to move a group of objects that are linked together, so we have the mesh parented to the root node. So the root node controls, well, it acts as the control element. If we want to position the group using the root node as the origin of the entire item, we can just select it alone, just that on its own, and then just type a value in the transform or the item transform and then location rotation, and that'll position it. So we can use that just to do that. But anyway, that's all by the by. So let's hide these. Ceiling and wall we don't need sitting or standing, so we'll hide those using the outliner. And let's just select the mesh, duplicate. So object, duplicate objects. That's going to be parented, so let's call this double click high.mesh. We'll call the block low.mesh. So we don't need the low at the moment, so we can hide it. So click on the little eye icon. And then what we can do, a very simple normal map. So if this were to be a parcel box, we don't want the sides, whoops, we don't want the edges to be sharp like this necessarily, but we also want to, we don't want to do two things. We don't want the edges to be sharp like this if we're using a normal map, because we can use the normal map to create slightly rounded edges as you might do with the cardboard box. But also with the low poly version, we need to get rid of these hard edges anyway in terms of mesh smoothing or sharp edges. Where is it? So if we go into edit mode and hide seams, and we've got the sharp edges highlighted, so we can get rid of these. So select all, edge, clear sharp. So that'll make our mesh go all mushy because it's using a single smoothing group. Because, and this is why we use normal maps, if we want these edges to be sharp in the sense of having a defined edge rather than what we have now, what we use is the high resolution version of the mesh, or we create a high resolution version of the mesh using edges. So we use our edge loop tool to place edges, and if we watch what happens to the way the mesh shades as we add these, so we'll just add one in the center, front to back, top to bottom, left to right, and in the middle. This just divides it up nicely so that we have equidistant subdivisions, but we're not yet using any subdivision modifier. So click, drag and slide. Click, drag, slide. Click, drag, slide. So what we're doing is laying down a basic structure that'll help when we actually add the modifier. What it'll do is it'll curve this corner. So what we're doing is laying down some basic structure that limits where that happens. So let's do that on all sides. Click, drag. Don't have to be precise because it doesn't really matter. Oh, we've already got one there. So undo. Click, drag, slide. And one at the bottom. Click, drag, slide. So we can see already, let's go back into object mode. We can see already how the shading has changed on the object. So if we just move this to one side, let's bring in the low poly. So we don't do anything to this per se, except not object mode, edit mode, select all. We need to remove the sharp for the low poly object. So that's what we had before we started adding these edges, but we've still got relatively sharp corners. Whoops. But the smoothing is completely different, and we can see that as we move the two objects around the scene and how the lighting changes. But what we can do now, sidebar, still got our high res, or what will be our high res selected. So select modifiers, and what we want here is, let's just get rid of this, that's not needed. Add modifier, subdivision surface. So we can see that's already changed the structure of the mesh a little bit. So that's what we have before. That's what we have afterwards. And what we can do is increase viewport resolution, and it tightens up that corner, but it rounds it off a little bit. Does this on all three corners. So we lay down, so if we go into object mode, so we use our loop. Oh, we've still got that tool selected, so deselect. So we use our edge loops to define how sharp our corner edges need to be. So if we wanted softer edges, what we can do is select that edge loop. So that's Alt, right click or left click, depending on how you've got your mouse set up. Double tap the G key for edge slide, or use that one. And we can see how that changes the corner. So if we watch, whoops, if we watch what's going on here and here, undo that. So edge slide. We can see how it changes the corner. So we don't need to be adding tons and tons of mesh structure to do certain things. So that is our high-res mesh. Simple as that. Well, in this instance it is. Simple as that. So what we want to do next with this is bake that Apologies for the noisy motorbike if that can be heard. So what we can do is bake that as a texture. So we have to do we have to do a couple of things. Get rid of the material that's on that already. We don't need one on that, so get rid of it. We just need a material on the low-res version of the mesh, or low-res version of the object. So make sure we have one. So if there isn't one, obviously assign one, click the plus button, or the new button if it's available. Then in shading, make sure there is an image assigned, and we might want to change this depending on how detailed the image needs to be. So let's get rid of this one. So click the X. That does that. Then we create a new one. We'll just call this bake. Change the width to 512, height to 256. Those are our compatible dimensions at the moment for Studio. Change the generated type, just a color grid, and then OK. So we have a new texture. Whoops, we're clipping through the scene, so we need to increase 2500. Right, so that's our new texture. So that's all we need for our material to do texture baking. You might see other tutorials online that set up all sorts of more complicated tutorials, more complicated node setups connecting to the normal node. For this and for our purposes, we don't need to do any of that. Just set up a basic material. So make sure you object the low resolution version that has a material assigned, and then in the node setup that has at minimum an image assigned, and that's attached to base color. That's all we need. So the next thing is UV editing. So what we have to do now, and again we have to reset the view, which is terribly annoying that we have to keep doing this, but we have to keep doing it anyway. 2500, because Blender doesn't carry across the settings. So what we need to do is make sure our object is mapped how we want it, because the default UV map for a cube is a cruciform. So it's something like this. Whoops. So that's one side, that's one side, that's one side. So we have 6 sides. That tends to leave quite a bit of waste because obviously it's not square. So that's wasted, that's wasted. And then there's that as well because we're in a square. But for our purposes, so we need to select our our image. So up here, that's our browse image to be linked. So this allows us to browse to, there it is, bake. So that's the image that we're going to use. So we've already set this object up by default to have each side unwrapped. So if the object isn't unwrapped, you obviously have to do that first. And depending on what the object is, you'll obviously have to unwrap it relative to the kind of texture map that you want to create. But for the purposes of what we're doing, we only need a basic separation of the faces. So we've just assigned select all we've done is just assigned mark seam to all the edges. Hi Nukes. So that's all we've done. It's just assigned seams to all the edges. So that means that when we unwrap this, we just get 6 separate sides. And it tends to mean that on a 512 by 256, we get less wasted space. We've only got this little section in the end here. Right, so what we want to do, now that we've got it UV mapped, is make sure that our UVs are the right way up. So let's do a bit of editing. One. Where's that gone? Whoops. Oh, there we go. 2, 3, and 4. So double check which way we're at. So viewpoint, front. Okay, so we can swizzle that one around like so, and do the same for the bottom, like so. It doesn't matter too much the orientation of UV maps for baking, because the process works out the orientation of the normals, the colours, based on the objects, not necessarily the orientation of the scene, not necessarily the orientation of the UV maps, but it's always a good idea just to organize them in a way that makes sense to you for later editing. Because although you're just creating, if we're just creating a normal map with this, but for derivations, products that are going to be derivable, you have to make sure that the normal map, not the normal maps, the UV maps make sense relative to what people are expecting, so that they can easily texture. Oh, hello, Tochi. So that we can make it easier for them to texture their items. So we've got our UV map done. So that's the basics. That's all we need. So the next thing we need to do is bake these, or bake the objects. So let's just switch out of edit mode for the moment. I'm going to save this file, save as. Normal. So Twitch normal baking 1, save as, just in case the whole thing freezes up on us. Right, so what we've got so far then is our high resolution mesh made, and it's a duplication basically of the low resolution mesh. So the two objects are identical essentially in terms of their basic structure. So you can create the high res from your low res, or a low res from your high res. Which way around you do it is just generally best personal preferences. So for IMVU at least anyway. But for more complex meshes, it might be worth creating the higher resolution mesh first, and then creating a lower resolution version from your higher resolution, so that you at least can get a better sense of how the low resolution should be structured relative to the high resolution. So This all sounds quite complicated and convoluted, but it makes sense once you start working with your objects in terms of, for example, if I just bring this up, something I was working on that have to, so if you were making a clothing item, what you might want to do first is create a higher, but not the high resolution version of the mesh. So essentially what you're creating is a mid-resolution mesh that you can then either reduce to create your low resolution, which is what this one would be, or you could then increase the resolution upwards to create the higher resolution. And that way you've got both the high and the low being based on the same mesh. For clothing, that might be more a more appropriate way to make clothing if you're going to do normal maps, because obviously once you start getting into clothing, you're talking about folds in cloth, fabric patterns and all that sort of stuff, which if you try and work that as a high resolution mesh from the get-go, it might be quite complicated. So it might be worth just creating something that's reasonably high resolution and then working down for your low and then working up for your high from the same mesh. Let's close that. Right, so back to our box. So we've got our two meshes, high and low. No material is needed on the low, no material is needed on the high. Low mesh has to have a material, and that has to be fully qualified, so it needs to have an image assigned to it. So this is the same image that you would use to create your texture maps or texture the object normally under normal circumstances. So once you've got that, you've then got to make sure that it's UV mapped properly or appropriately relative to what you're trying to achieve. And again, you've got to keep derivations in mind for this. And then once you've got that, what we do is exit edit mode, make sure both the high and the low resolution mesh are in the same place. I'm just going to switch back to make it easier to see. So both meshes have to be in the same place, like that. What we then need to do is switch render mode to cycles. So we've got the render engine. At the moment it's on Eevee, but for texture baking we need cycles. So click on that, and if you've got the oomph to be able to do this, you might be able to do this in real-time rendered, but as we're streaming, doesn't really matter too much. But we do that, we have to switch engines because we need access to the bake tools. Those don't appear in the Eevee render engine. So there's nothing down here. So we have to switch to cycles. And then we can access those options. And this is the bake panel. There are a lot of options for this. What we want to do is select the bake type and switch that to normal. So select that, the properties will change, and then for this we can leave these untouched. We don't need those to change those. What we want is selected to active, because what we're doing is essentially rendering down the high resolution mesh to the texture that's assigned to the low resolution. So select those, well, click the checkbox. We don't need to worry too much about the other settings apart from ray distance. Now this one may need to be changed a little depending on the objects you are baking, because this defines the distance. Well, it tells Blender how far away the high resolution object might be from the low resolution object. So that distance between the two helps, well, if Blender knows what that distance is, it helps it during the bake process. Now for an object like this, that might be okay at 0. But for some objects, like a skirt, for example, so if your low resolution skirt was just a simple shape like that, but your high resolution had folds in it, whoops, and those folds went up the entire mesh, the distance between the two, so let's say that is the peak or top of the mesh from our high resolution, and these troughs are the low points. So our low resolution might be sitting on this same plane, so it matches the highs rather than the lows. So Blender would need to know what the distance is approximately between this point and this point. So this distance. So you'll have to do a bit of playing around with the distance on some of your objects. But for this, we might be able to get away with that. Let's just switch back to UV editing. So we have our objects all set up. Go back into object mode. Make sure we're in, so we can see, so we're in render properties. Whoops. So we can see our properties. So let's try 0 now. And all we need to do, select the high res, then shift click the low res. So we have our two meshes selected. And then all we do is click the bake button. Let's just double check. So normal, those are okay. That's active. Ray distance, that's fine. Right, so click the bake button. So there, it's baked our normal maps, our normal map, I should say, but we do need to set the ray distance. So let's try 1. Rebake. Because what that is doing is it's rendering the coincidental surfaces that we can see here. So because of the way that the object is made, I don't know, he's probably resting from partying, I guess. Send him a message on IMVU and see where he's at, Touchy. Where was I? Oh yes, so coincidental surfaces. So that's what that is. And that results in this discoloration. So let's try 1 meter. Rebake. So there we go. That's cleared up that. Although there's a funny... I know, it's check his Instagram, see what he's up to. But that is our normal map. So if we make sure we've got our low res selected, we can enter edit mode and we can see how the normal map has been baked relative to each face of the UV. What we might need to do actually is something else. Low res. Let's double check, because those colors look a little off. So just double check. Sidebar. Item. Orientation is 0. We don't want negative values. So one of the things that you have to watch out for when you're using Blender is some of the values will sometimes have a negative sign in front of them. So this one that was just edited was -0. So you might wonder why, if that makes a difference. It does, because negative, we don't see the positive, but negative and positive are indications of direction. I think negative is anti-clockwise and positive is clockwise. So that would be that way, wouldn't it? And that does affect some things if there are negative values present in the meshes that you are editing. Because Blender understands the negative value to mean that the mesh is orientated in a particular way that may affect certain things that you do with it. So always double check. Let's just double check. That's a low res. So what we're going to do is we've deleted the minus. Just going to, where is it? Object, apply, rotation and scale. So we are fixing the object in place. Let's do the same thing for the high res. This may not actually make any difference to the normals that we're looking at or that we can see on screen, but it's always worth doing as a stage in your prep work. So let's do that again. High res, no, that's a low res, so high res, shift click, low res, and then rebake. No, that didn't make any difference. Good. Right, so that is our normal map. So what we can do now is save. So image, save as. Where are we? Twitch. Normal bake. And you want to save that. If you use PNG, make sure you disable, turn off or disable the compression. You want no compression for these files. But alternatively, save it with a lossless or uncompressed format. So BNP, Targa Raw, or TIFF. Don't use JPEG because that can introduce compression artifacts into the image that may affect the normal map adversely. So let's just go with Targa Raw for this. We don't need RGBA, A being alpha, so we just click on RGBA, RGB, and then we can save as. Right, so that's our normal map. What we can do, let's hide the high res. So if we select the root node, it's still all linked up. So we can save this file, save as number 2, and then let's just export this. Oh, so double check. We don't have any smoothing on this at all. Actually, let's do this. Let's duplicate this. So double check which way we're pointing. So I'm going to duplicate this. It's going to use exactly the same material. Just push it off to one side. Like, oh no, actually, let's leave that one in the center so we know. Going to set sharp edges on this one. So select all, that tool's selective, edge, sharp. So we're going to export both of these objects at the same time as part of the same product. But one of them has sharp edges assigned, the other one doesn't. So let's just double check. So we can disable that, get rid of that. So we need that. They both use the same material, so they're both going to use the same normal map. But, as we'll see, so let's just save as. As we'll see, so select, no, is it meshes? Or it doesn't matter, I don't think. So FBX file, so we're selecting our meshes, root, export, FBX. Blah, 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 blah. So selected objects, check. Everything else is okay. Geometry, apply modifiers, check. Armature, add leaf bones, always uncheck. Don't need any animation, so click, uncheck that, then export. So that is our FBX exported. So as Studio. So IMVU Studio. Right, so we need to derive from furniture item. So create. Rooms and furniture, furniture. And we can go with the empty furniture item. That's this one. That's all right. Click derive. So there's nothing there. So import. Hamburger, edit, import. This will load up your file browser thingamajig. What did we call this? Twitch normal baking 3. There we go. Open. So we'll get the importer. Right, so one skeleton, that's our node. 2 meshes. Because we didn't join the objects together, we actually have 2 independent separate meshes and 1 material. So we'll go through the process. So set up FBX, change the scale to 0.01. Yeah, Tochi, yes, you always disable add leaf bones, because what that does, if you... Actually, that's a good question. So let's pause. Hang on, let's just go through this and then we'll answer that question. Just to get this imported. Right, so scale 0.01. 3 bones, 2 meshes. So with FBX, any object that's included in the FBX file is considered a bone within the FBX hierarchy. So each of our 2 meshes are a bone. So even though we only had a single root node, it considers the root node, literally the root node, but then the 2 meshes a bone in terms of the relationship, the hierarchical relationship between the objects as a bone. So we end up with 3 bones and 2 meshes. So that can be a little confusing sometimes when you see that. Right, low mesh 001, that's all right. block 01, that's okay. TGA, let's just replace this with a flat color. Let's use that dark purple one. Was that a PNG? No, that was a TGA. Make sure you use PNGs if you can, because it doesn't like TGA files. Actually, let's go with this green one. Double check. Oh no, that's listing the right. Okay, so next, no animation, preview. That's okay. And then import. It'll do its previewy thing. But I don't know how clear that is. So it has not included the normal map yet. All we've done is just replaced the normal map that was assigned to the cubes. We've just replaced that with the flat color, just for illustrative purposes, so that we make this bit easier to see or understand. But you can see that this object has sharp edges. Probably just about make that out. Whereas the other object doesn't. There are no sharp edges, or hard lines, I should say. There are no hard lines appearing on the object. So we can see them on this one, but not on this one. So we'll keep that in mind for the next step. But just to answer Tochi's question about leaf bones. So yoink, yoink. So leaf bones. Basically, no. Always disable them, because IMVU, the skeleton, already has leaf bones, essentially, and that's these bones at the tips, and these are often called the, when you look at the hierarchy, yeah, that's the skeleton. Where's the, so when you look at let's go right down through the hierarchy. That is essentially what these X-tip bones are. So those are terminal bones. They terminate the skeleton. So if you add, or if you leave the leaf bones option set when you export something, what it'll do is it'll add another bone essentially to the skeleton, which causes problems for IMVU, because obviously it then means that the skeleton actually has more bones than should be interpreted on the skeleton. So it changes the hierarchy, the hierarchical structure of the skeleton. So always disable that, even for furniture items. But that's why you disable it, because the skeleton already has leaf bones, essentially, which are these terminal bones at the ends of the fingers, the toes. That's these two bones, and the leaf bone at the top of the skeleton, top of the head. So that's the bone that sits above the head bone. So yes, always disable those, or disable the option so that they're not included in the skeleton. Right, let's close that. So back to our normal map. So we've got our object with sharp edges. So what we're going to do, actually, let's try changing this to a better color. I've got a light grey in here somewhere. Okay, well let's go with the purple that we were going to use before. I think it's just because the green is very saturated. Preview. Oops, and it's reset the view. That's not made much difference either. Right, well, let's just add the normal map. So what we're going to do is click on the button, get the panel up, click Add Image, browse to our normal map. What did we save it as? Yes, you do have to be careful with the add leaf bones because it messes up the skeleton. Because especially if you're using FBX, the thing with the skeleton to think about is that it's a hierarchy. And IMVU is expecting that hierarchy to exist in a particular format or pattern or structure. If you do something to that structure to change what IMVU is expecting, it'll break it. And that's often you'll see it with poses, avatar poses, where the skeleton has gone all, what's that movie with Kurt Russell? The Thing. Is it The Thing? Where they're in the Arctic. It'll go all thing on you. Where's the, right, so image. So be careful with that. Disable it. Now where were we? Furniture. Right, so that's Twitch normal map bake. So we're going to save this as a PNG. So that's the normal map. Just going to export this or re-export. It's a PNG. Furniture. Right, that's okay. Scroll. F5, refresh. Oh, there it is. Twitch normal bake. Open. So don't know how clear this is going to be. So that's our normal map. And all we're going to do is click preview. It keeps resetting the view. But there is our cube. Or that's our box. So if we take a look at this more closely, so the one on the left, that has our sharp edges saved or baked in, not baked into, that's the wrong word. It's the mesh is split to create those hard lines that we were looking at in the mesh. So let's just undo that. So on its own, we get those hard lines, whereas on the other one we don't. But with the normal map in place, our box or cube with the hard edges looks a bit funny, whereas the box with no sharp edges, so this one, looks exactly like we want it to. And this is because the normal map is creating the impression of those hard edges. So in other words, we don't need to split our meshes to create hard edges. In fact, if we do that, it causes problems because, as we can see, the top of the two boxes look remarkably different. So we've got a lot of dark shading on this one, but on the other one it's perfectly fine, and that's what we want. So this is good, this is bad. So we don't want to be using sharp edges on objects that have normal maps. So whilst you're working on your objects in Blender or 3D Studio Max, it doesn't really matter which, when you're working on them, it may be a little off-putting that your mesh looks a little mushy and undefined. This is the low resolution version, obviously, that the low res looks a bit mushy. So it might be tempting to put hard edges in place. We don't need them, because the high resolution mesh and the normal map that's created, those are the things that define whether something should be sharp or soft. So when we export, we end up with proper shading. So this is actually a shading error, all of this. So the way that that's all gone all wonky, that's as a direct result of the edges being sharp, which breaks the normal map. So that is our box. But what this now means, so let's save this file, save as, so Twitch. Oh, they have character limits. Dagnabbit. Prezi box. Save. So what you can do with this, so that's our box. We've got our normal map. What we can now do, go back into Blender. Now that we've got a normal map, what we can, oh well, actually let's do another one. So we're going to duplicate this box again. So it's again going to be using the same material, same node setup, same UV mapping. So object, duplicate, move that over, because what we can now do is play around with our shape a little bit. Oh, hang on, let me just, yeah, that's okay. So we're going to make our box look a little worn out and damaged. I'm not going to do anything else to it other than what we're doing now. So this is the low resolution version. Let's put a edge loop in there. Squish that inwards a little. So scale, left click. So that's what we're going to do with that. Object mode. Save this file. Whoops, save as. For save. Double check. And then we're going to. So again, we haven't put any hard edges, any smoothing or not smoothing, sharp edges on our new object. Select all three, export, FBX, what versions for. And again, selected objects, tick. Everything else is okay. Geometry, that's all right. Modifier, armature, always disable. Add leaf bones. No bake. Export. So let's create a new project. Create. Oh, there we go. This is the slow dance. Hi, Ugos. Apologies for getting to your comment slowly, but too many windows open and I don't want to cause Blender to crash or lock up. So empty furniture item, derive. So import, file, import. So we want the next Twitch file. Same process, so skeleton, we've now got 3 meshes obviously set up. So 0.01. And of course that now means we have 4 bones and 3 meshes. Again, because each mesh is considered a bone within the hierarchy. Next, let's just replace that with a different color. Let's go with orange. Next, preview. That's all right. So there's our wonky box. And again, smoothing is all assigned to one group. We have no sharp edges. So let's just assign the normal map. So add image. Where is it? There it is. Preview. And there is our wonky box, but it has the same normal map. So we've created the same sort of sharp edges using the normal map without breaking the normals by assigning actual physical splits in the mesh. But what we can do, and what this demonstrates, is that once we have our basic normal map, so once we've got this, we can then do other things to the mesh, so long as we're not changing the shape of it too much, so that the normal map doesn't necessarily represent the object that we then end up with. So we can do things like this, where we're just basically, you know, somebody was sat on the box when they shouldn't have done it, and it's crushed it, but it's kept the edges as defined by the normals. So let's add what we can do with this as well to emphasize this. I wouldn't necessarily advise doing this, but let's see if we can do it as a quickie, if I can remember how to do it in this program. Can't remember how to do it. Okay, so let's close that. Actually, what we do need to do, and this is another thing that's interesting, so this is why you have to think about your objects when you're making them for your products, because UV map, we're using the same UV map for all our objects. So that's that object. That's that object. Even though it's been modified, it's still the same fundamental UV map. So what we can do is save that, UV, export UV layout. So click, get the dialog. So what we want is Twitch. What did we call this? Normal baking brackets UV. We want the wireframe and the faces to be filled. So fill opacity to 1 and then click OK. Then open that in the application I don't like using because they are not very nice people anymore. Is this one, which shall remain nameless. But been using it too long and I know my way around it too easily. Or too well, I should say. Right, so what we want is the normal map, not the normal map, we want the wireframe that we've just saved, which is, where is that? There it is. So that's the wireframe, and that's the normal map. So what we're going to do is a quickie shininess map. So if you watched the video previously, we were talking about shininess maps being based on grayscale values. So anything that's white is highly shiny, anything that's dark is not so shiny. So let's just flat fill this. Whoops. Black. Create a background. So what I want to do is just do a quick border around each face. Oops. Oops. Lock. Because what I'm just going to do is blur that a little bit. Copy. And yes, there are different ways of doing this, but this will do for now. Because let's do a little square in the middle. Whoops. Grayscale. Blur that. Is that the top? Which one's that one? Yes, that's the top. So the next one along is the side, the front. So let's duplicate that, copy, paste. Let's call this shininess. Your shininess. Flatten, export, or save as. Whoops, saved it in the wrong place. File, furniture, Blender. Then OK. And what we can do, so that's how the objects look as they currently are by default. So what we can do now is add a shininess map that we just created, which is, there it is. Add that, preview. So I don't know how easily that's coming across on screen or on the video, but you can see the edges are mighty shiny. There's our shininess patch in the middle there. None on the other sides, but we've got a shininess on the top, shininess at the front, and then the rest of the box is pretty much matte. But we can boost that effect by changing the reflectivity value. So if we change the slider or type of value to 100, that's gone quite shiny, right? Super shiny. But it emphasizes, in combination with the normal map, it emphasizes the edges of the box. Whereas on our one with the edges that we sharpened intentionally, it's broken them. So the shininess has gone a bit wonky. So that is a basic cardboard box, although it's just orange at the moment. In fact, let's do so what we can do oops, should have used the... But this is one of the advantages that you do have, is that once you have the... Let's just grab those, plonk them in there. Oh, that'll do. Close, don't need that. You can then create your diffuse, save as. So the whole set, the diffuse, the normal map and the shininess map, work together to emphasize the effect itself. Yes, that's in the right place. So if we now replace the orange with our newly created diffuse, which is there. What we end up with is that. Obviously we've gone a bit over the top with the white lines on the outside border, but you get the point. So when you've got everything working together as a group, it emphasizes the effect and looks much better than the original one. Let's tone that down a bit. So that's these ones. So let's go with 25. In fact, actually, get rid of those. Unfortunately, you can't do this to multiple objects at the same time. Or you could just get rid of them altogether. Let's try that. Save. Flatten. Override. Okay. And load that into Studio. So we're going to replace the white lines. A song from the 90s. It's going to replace. Preview. So there's our box with the shiny edges. So that is a simple project for creating normal maps. So what I'll do is upload these source files so you can play around with them. So if you've got Blender, you might want to download Blender 2.83 LTS, but this should work in Blender 9.0 and above. Let me save that. So save. I'll upload these files, make them available for you to play around with. But that is the basics of baking a normal map. In tomorrow, well, I don't know if it'll be tomorrow, but in the next video, what we might have a look at is trying to do the same thing Kyle, hello. Haven't seen you in ages. It's worth having a look at Studio, just so, because you're going to need to anyway. Yes, so obviously you can then... so here's the thing with the shininess, which Tochi just mentioned, by changing the value. So once you've got your shininess map in place, the shininess map, as we were discussing in the previous video, that determines what parts of your object are shiny. And the reflectivity, there are different technical words for this, but in essence, the reflectivity makes the shininess look hard or soft. It doesn't always pan out that way, but if we disable it completely, we can see that the shininess effect has been reduced quite significantly, so that it's almost non-existent. It still is there, it's quite subtle. So we can use shininess to define where the shiny effect appears on the object, and then reflectivity to define how shiny something looks. So as we mentioned in the previous video, it's the difference between making something like dull, worn out leather versus shiny, brand new PVC. So for leather, you might want to keep the values quite low. So let's say 11, see what that does. So we can see the shininess, the highlight is becoming harder just with that small value. So that might be your worn out leather, whereas bumping it all the way up to 100, that gives us very shiny, plasticky PVC reflectivity. In fact, actually, whilst we're here, what we could have done is, and this is when the three maps work together, get rid of the color. Whoops, OBS just disconnected and reconnected, so you might have lost a little bit there, I don't know. I'll just keep going. I'm recording this anyway, so let's just bring these back. Don't want the color. So yoink all these all the way up to their full value again. So we're going to save this. Whoops, save as. Where's the... Most odd. Okay, so save that. So this is where you can start to be quite clever with your maps, because what we can do, so that's the shininess map that we just modified. So that the text becomes shiny like paint. So now that it should be doing it, might not be quite as clear. So the text is also now quite shiny. Oh, we can see it better there. So the text is now also quite shiny relative to the black that surrounds it. So we can use our shininess map in combination with all the other maps, the diffuse, normal, and shiny, much more effectively. So we can create much more interesting visual effects by by taking advantage of the way that each of these behaves. So diffuse is basically what we see, so it's just a green box. The normal map defines any structure, so rounded corners for our box in this instance, and then we've got the shininess that adds the highlights. So if you wanted to be doing this properly, so if this were a tin box, for example, you might have shiny shiny edges because the tin or the metal box is worn out on the edges, whereas it might be dull on the inner face, or vice versa. So we can use all these maps to describe all of that and make much more interesting products. But there is one thing you do need to be aware of. If you do use Studio and you do use normal maps and shininess maps, you have to be aware that these products, although they will open in IMVU Classic, let's just save this actually. Whoops. Although they, oh dear, did I just, although they will open in IMVU Classic, come on. It's very slow, there we go. The way that you have to save as, what do we call this? Twitch Prezi-box 2. The way that you have to prep your meshes for use with IMVU, with Studio, means that if you open your normal mapped and shininess mapped object in Classic, it removes the normal map and the shininess map and it uses the diffuse, but your object will look mushy like this. So if you're going to use Studio, you're going to have to decide just to use Studio to make Studio compatible products, or products that will open up in the new desktop. Just answering Kyle's question about the 2.5. The limit, as far as I'm aware, the limit at the moment is still the same as Classic. So you're bound to 512 in a single direction, 512 by 256, 256 by 512. But I do understand that they are looking at implementing larger image sizes, but I'm not sure what that limit is. I mean, it'll be 512 by 512 at a minimum, but it might mean that they might actually start thinking about going upwards to 1024 by 1024. But as you can imagine, the way that clothing is split up in particular, where clothing items can have a front, a back and sleeves, so that's 3 diffuse images. If those are all 1024, and then you've got normal maps and shininess maps to add on top of that, that's a lot of data that's going to be floating through the system. So 512 by 512, I'll expect them to do that, but I would imagine that there's not much of an incentive to go above that, because of the way that IMVU works, where everything has to be sent over, what is it? The statistics they say are 80% of their clientele now of the user base is on mobile. You can't have 1024 by 1024 textures being downloaded over mobile app bandwidth, because it just is too much data. So it's unlikely that they'll go to 1024, but they might do it just for the avatar skins, but who knows. Personally, 512 by 512 is more than enough. It just means you have to think about what you're doing. But as I was saying, if you're going to use Studio, you're going to have to make a decision as to whether you are basically making products for Studio and the new client, because they're not backward compatible. They will open, but there's no smoothing. So you won't see any meshes with hard edges, because we can't use, as we've just been discussing, we can't use hard-edged objects with smoothing, sharp edges, I should say. Oh, hey, Gaff. You've missed all the fun. We've just been doing an exercise where we've been creating some normal maps. So you missed all of that. Luckily I've recorded it, so... Yes, partying too hard. So there's a lot to keep in mind, and there's a lot to consider for IMVU, for going forward with IMVU Studio, but it is worth it. It is worth doing, but you will have to think about your meshes, how you mesh and how you texture. But it's nothing to be scared of. So today we were just looking at then just creating a normal map using texture baking. So in the next one we'll look at trying to do the same thing but using an image based normal map, or a normal map that's created from an image. But as I say, I'll upload these, make all these source files available so that you can have a play around with them. Oh, speaking of which, no, Tochi, it's not something you type. For the life of me, I keep thinking that says high-res snog, but it's not. Obviously, it's high-res no background, but it's this. Well, it's these buttons at the top here. So we've got all of these bits. So we can now turn on. So if we click on the eye, we can now turn on a skeleton so that we can see all the elements of the room. Or well, it's actually the skeleton for everything. So we're seeing the skeleton of the room, the furniture item, and the avatar. So if we mouse over, you might see the skeleton briefly appear before the avatar's shadow. And then, of course, we've got the MCG pose, but that's obviously applicable to clothing rather than furniture. So we've got that. But standing behind the box. But high res no snogging is this button. So if you click that, let's get an appropriate background. That'll be fine. So let's do that. Position the camera or the view, then click the camera button. That takes a high-res no snogging picture, drops it into the desktop. So we can now take a look at our snogged image in our photo editor. So there's the image. And there it is. So it's a very high-res, no snogging image. So it's quite large. So again, it's square. The image boundary is square, but the actual thing that it takes is obviously whatever the screen is at. I think you can you go full screen with this? I'm sure you could go full screen, but I can't remember how it's done. And then what's that one? Oh, that's full. Oh no, that's that's the furniture thing. Oh, speaking of which, so now that we've got the normal maps in place, let's oops. So let's drop our fireball light in. Let's move it. So we can see how the normal map plays with our light sources. It would be better if it wasn't doing the fireball effect, but you can see how the normal maps work. So is it 2048 by 2048? Oh no, it's bigger than that. It's no, it's actually massive. It's 4096. Well, the image space, so the entire canvas, is 4096 by 4096. So that's massive. Yeah, so that's how big that is. You can even see his eyebrows. That's higher than the current resolution. So that's, what's that at? 2048 by 2048. Yugos, yes it is. It is possible to make face animations in Blender, but you need to use... That's massive. So yeah, won't get many complaints about not having higher enough resolution images to play around with. So that is the furniture decoration mode, that camera icon, which you can also get. It looks like a printer to me. Is that supposed to be a chair? I guess that looks like a chair. But you can get to it also by clicking the... so we're in the inventory. Click on that, and then we click on this little sliders icon. I'm not quite sure what that actually is, but click on that. We get the pop-up, and then if you just click on furniture, it automatically switches us into furniture or decoration mode. Oh, and discovered. So the other video, the other day, when we were looking at these, couldn't figure out what these things were for. So if we click on the one with that, we get dummy avatars appearing. So I guess that's so that we can see the objects relative to dummy avatars. Get rid of those. Not quite sure what that one does yet. That probably applies to something to do with the avatar. But group. No group. So that's those two. Right, so we'll call it quits there because it's that's an hour and a half. Wasn't expecting to go that long. So like I say, I'll upload these files so that they're available for you to play around with, and you can export them as your... That'll include the FBX, so you can just drop that straight into Studio. But if you want, the blend file will be included as well, so you can go through the process of exporting that yourself and see how that works. So let me just I don't know if that works actually, so let's just do a IMVU is a little funny with some of the characters. Right, so we've got crumpled, plain, and then sharped. Right, save as, or just save over. And then yes, I'll just make all of this available, and then we can play around with them and see how it all works. Yes, well, I mean, this is why the files, we make them available. Because, yes, Blender isn't, well, 3D in general isn't particularly easy to learn. So if you have some basic projects to open and take a look at in Blender or Max or Maya, thank you, Reg. If you've got some files that you can look at, it makes the whole process easier to do in terms of learning the application, because you don't have to worry about bits and pieces. You don't have to worry about knowing what you're doing. You can just open the files and just take a look at what's going on in the file, and that's it. You don't need to do anything else. So, oh yes, so you goes. I'll just do this quickly, just so that you can see. So for face animations, you need to use female 04 shape key, because what you need are the shapes, and those are the things that you then animate. Haven't done a full tutorial on this, but basically if you watch the face, select one of those, you don't animate doing what I'm about to do. This is just to demonstrate what shape keys do and what they are. So we've got all these various parameters. I think there's a couple of hundred, there's over 100 of them. Each one represents a particular shape of the face. At the moment, all we're seeing is just the root face. So if we change the value, see what happens to the eye. So that shape key stores, when it's at 0, it's stored at the default, which is the base avatar. When it's at 1, the eye starts to cross over. So can we do it with the other one? Yeah, so there we go, cross-eyed. So this section defines the parameters of the shape that's stored within the shape key. So once you've got all of that, what you want is a shape key editor, and then we have all these, well, it's a duplicate listing of all the shape keys that are shown in the shape key list. They're all listed down here as well. And what you do is just select the shape key you want to change, and you just modify the value like so. Whoops. Move that to 20. Make that go back. So is that? Let's go with that one. That's duh. And that. So that is your shape key animation. And that's all you do. And then of course you've got to export this. So you go through the process of, let's just change this. Dir.pose. Make sure it's single user so that it saves the data, and then you just export. And you go through the process, same sort of FBX process, but you make sure that you set export FBX. Make sure that you set bake animation properties her the way that IMVU wants it. So disable NLA strips and force start end keying. Save the file, and that creates your shape key file that you then load into IMVU. But that's the basics of shape keys. So you can snip this section out of the video and then you'll have a separate part for that. But so back to what we were doing. So close that. Don't save. So yes, the files will be made available. Then you can play around. And so in the next video, we'll take a look at. It is, funnily enough, that's a good point, Gav. Funnily enough, it actually is easier to do shape keys than it is to do morphs. Shape keys in Blender is, once you've got them all set up, it's much easier because you're not messing around with all those duplicate mesh heads. It's the way that they did it in Blender is actually, well, I wouldn't say it's pretty genius, but that's the best way. It's pretty genius comparatively. But anyway, so that'll be for another video. Yes, it's Blender isn't any better or worse than any of the other applications. It's just what suits you and just how much work you are willing to put into it to learn how to use it. It's as simple as that. There's no, so the discussion of which is better is kind of moot. You know, if you've got $3,000 or however much it's worth now, if you've got $3,000 and can afford a professional license, then just use 3D Studio Max. If it doesn't bother you, then just use it. If you don't have $3,000 or whatever it is, then use Blender or whatever alternative is available. Now that we have FBX, we can theoretically use other applications, but there may be hoops and loops to jump through in order to create content using those apps. But Blender is no better or worse than anything else. It's just a different way of working and whether you're willing to get used to it. That's it. End of story, end of discussion. You know, so no matter what you see on the forums, wherever you see the discussion, it's all just nonsense really at the end of the day. If you've got the time to put into learning the application, you'll learn it and you'll get on with using it. Anything else is just moot. Right, so call it quits there, and we shall see you on the next video. And in that one, we'll take a look at doing the same sort of thing as we've just done in this video, in this exercise. We'll take a look at doing that using normal maps made from an image. Right, so thanks for hanging out, Gaff, Tochi. Who else was there? Kylesaur, and Nukes. So those are the guys on Twitch, and then there's Nukes and Ugos on YouTube, on the YubChub. So thanks for hanging out. Thanks for hanging out, lurkers. Do the usual subscribe, push the buttons, and whatever it is on whatever platform you're using. And we shall see you on the next video. So, bye for now, everyone.